prophet said, he said, at the end of time comes and you are planting a seedling or a sapling, he said, finish planting it. I didn't say freak out. He didn't say run for the hills, you know. He said, no, finish what you're doing. And he could have juxtaposed the end of time with something else. Why did he juxtapose it with the planting of a seedling or a sapling?
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Rhamis Kent from Zaytuna College. Rhamis is a permaculturist and regenerative designer, and we talk about his journey and insights from teaching permaculture around the world. We go into the economic system and how we're all being programmed as consumers. Rhamis discusses the big questions of life and how they shape our intentions and outcomes. Rhamis also talks about his Muslim faith and how Islamic teachings connect to the land. There are a lot of learning resources and books referenced in this conversation, which was recorded at Pioneers in Berkeley, April 2023. It was a bit of a unique one. I hope you enjoy it. Rhamis Kent. Welcome, we're here with Rhamis Kent. Rhamis is a scholar in residence at Zaytuna College and wears a whole bunch of other hats as well.
Yes.
I think we met about 20 minutes ago.
That's
so this
right.
is going to be a fun conversation.
Yes.
Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me to be here.
And, you know, the context here, we're both here at Pioneers. We met through Emmett Brennan.
Brennan.
Yeah, featured you in Reflection, A Walk with Water, the
Right.
film. And I remember watching that film being like, that guy had some really good lines. I love it.
You're very kind. And then we actually had an opportunity to do an earlier film that he did it premiered in 2015 called Inhabit, Permaculture Perspective, which I think the great thing about the way he's put his films together, there's something about the composition, like there's a quality that his movies possess that I really, really like them. I mean, regardless of not because I'm in them, but it's just like there's something about the substance of the film. It's got a soul. Yeah. It's not fluffy. It's not showy. It's not it's very much grounded and it's very engaging. So I really like the way he puts films together. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And you spoke eloquently to topics around water and reflection, and curious to unpack a bit of the context of like your relationship in this space between permaculture and regenerative design and thinking about the ecology on this planet.
Yeah, so I mean, my formal background's in engineering. I have a degree in mechanical engineering, and I came to permaculture design, or I'll say broadly what I'll call regenerative design, by way of engineering. So we were just talking earlier about I think the connections between engineering, which is really, I think more broadly speaking, it's really about systems thinking. And systems design, and then how that actually relates to something like permaculture design or other sort of similarly aligned or situated regenerative design systems, whether you're talking about biodynamics or you're talking about, biointensive farming or agroecology, or, you're really looking at an assembly of components that are connected in ways that allows for each of the components to offer whatever it is it has to offer in in the best way. And so I think I kind of liken it to, what you see in the body. The body is comprised of, different parts, different organs, different appendages, and they aren't assembled in any sort of old random way. They're connected in a very particular way that actually accentuates the qualities of each of the individual organs, each of the individual components. And because they're connected in a very particular way that allows for them to function within the context of the whole, that produces, this miraculous result. It's actually quite remarkable to think about what's sort of the underlying principle, what is sort of the underlying pattern, what is this ethos, how did that happen? And I think similarly, this is something that you see within, these regenerative design systems that are connected to kind of trying to partner with ecology or ecological systems, is that there's a terrestrial body that is comprised of a variety of different components, different organs that are connected in a very, I think, in a very intentional way that allows for the body to function in the manner that it does. And so I had an interest in getting a better understanding as to how that works, and especially within the confines of looking at issues that I think are challenging or confronting humanity, whether it's food insecurity, water insecurity, ecological dysfunction, land degradation, desertification. And then these obviously have impacts on, outcomes with people, whether or not they're in situations that are secure or stable. And so, I had studied with Jeff Lawton in Australia in the early part of 2009.
And Jeff's a famous permaculture teacher and educator.
Right, yeah. He started the Permaculture Research Institute of Australia. So I had met him during the summer of 2008. Funnily enough, I was an administrator for the first Zaytuna. At that point, it was the Zaytuna Institute before they became Zaytuna College. The Zaytuna Institute Summer Arabic Intensive. So I was an administrator for the program. There was a student in the program that used to work for the Lawtons. And then it was through them that I learned about what permaculture was. And I saw the film that he did about greening the desert in Jordan. Yeah. And I immediately was like, I have to do this. And so I ended up meeting him that summer. And then I told him I'd be interested in coming out to study with him. And he said, yeah, come on down. And that's where it all started. And then eventually I was down there for about 3 months. I interned with him. I worked on, I took a few courses. I worked on a couple of consultancies with him. And then, a few years later, he invited me to be a co-director at PRI. PRI. Permaculture Research Institute. And then it's actually through my working with him that I began to work in the in the Middle East.
He's had quite a rippled influence in New Zealand, where I'm based through Kawanga Institute, and I've watched a lot of his.
Oh yeah, so Kay and Bob, Bob, yeah, absolutely. Okay. Bob Corker came back.
Oh wow, okay, yeah,
no, I know.
Sweet,
yeah,
sweet,
yeah. So I mean, it's a pretty small world. Like once you meet a couple of people, you pretty much.
Yeah, we'll put links in the show notes, especially to Jeff's materials, because he's got so much tremendous content out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just absolutely love his style and how he articulates things with kind of the little chalkboardy, but digital, and and he just delivers it straight. Like,
it's been interesting kind of watching how that's developed over the years. So he definitely has this. I think one of the things I appreciate about Jeff is he's very persistent, and he just keeps plugging. He just keeps going.
All of the world's problems can be solved.
All the world's problems can be solved in regard. Yeah. So I had a chance to study with him in 2009, And then, the following year, the first course I taught, interestingly enough, was on the east side of Detroit. And then, basically from 2010, I just basically said, look, I'll go anywhere to work. So, I've worked in, I think the first course I taught after Detroit might have been Greece, in the island of Spetses. Funnily enough, was where the movie Knives Out, the latest Knives Out, was filmed in Spetses. It's really funny. I was watching the film, and I'm like, why does the place look so familiar? And then it turns out it was filmed in Spetses.
It's funny.
I taught in Palestine, the West Bank. I taught in Turkey, Ethiopia. I've done courses in Italy, southern Spain, multiple courses. Italy's actually been quite a place that I've been to quite a few times to teach. Western Sahara, Morocco, Tunisia.
Wow. And so with this global perspective and this kind of permaculture design, regenerative design perspective, what are some of the patterns you're seeing right now in this world, 2023? Like, what are you observing?
Well, I think, funnily enough, they aren't really any different than the patterns that we have seen historically. That's probably one of my favorite things to do, is try to position a lot of this discussion within a larger historical lens. So I'm a fan of reading texts about the patterns of history, and specifically how the relationships that human beings kind of broker with the places that they live, like either their ability to do that or inability to do that, how that has pretty much driven history. So, I can remember one of the first books I probably read that kind of covers that topic is, the Jared Diamond's books is Guns, Germs, and Steel, The Fate of Human Societies. And there's his book, Collapse, How Society Chooses to Fail to Succeed. And then there's Carter and Dale's book, Topsoil and Civilization. There's another writer kind of in the same vein as Jared Diamond, named James C. Scott. He wrote a book called Against the Grain: The Deep History of the Earliest States. And these are all sort of surveys of history, but like seen through the lens of either agriculture or kind of the husbanding of land. A couple others that come to mind. There's a guy named Guy Theodore Wrench, who wrote a book called Reconstruction by Way of the Soil. There's W.C. Loudermilk's Conquest Through the Land for 7,000 Years. There's David Montgomery's book, Dirt. So all of these are books that are looking at sort of the history of humanity, the kind of history of civilization. But again, the filter through which it's being seen is, either agriculture or some kind of, relationship that people have with land. And I think the interesting thing about Diamond's book and also Scott's writings is it's just how much of history is driven, again, by those factors. So if you look in Diamond's book, Collapse, he identifies 8 modes of failure for human civilization. The top 3, the top 3 most common are, you start with deforestation and habitat destruction. And then you go to soil problems, which would include soil erosion, salinization, loss of fertility. And then you go to water management problems. So these are sort of listed as 3 different problems or 3 different modes of failure. But then what happens is what you come to realize is that they're not 3 different modes of failure. There are 3 different stages of the same mode of failure of the first. So if you remove the vegetation from a place, if you cut down the forest, you're going to have soil problems. Right. Because you no longer have the coverage that protects landscapes from, the effects of being impacted by, rain, the sun, and wind. So yeah, you're going to have problems with soil erosion. You're going to have problems with the salting of soils because of rapid evaporation. Some places more than others. you're going to have problems with fertility because you're eroding away the bank of fertility that you have in soil. And then once that happens, and say the ground gets very hard because it's exposed, you're going to have water problems because you no longer have the ability to, again, re-infiltrate water back into the ground, which would replenish, your storages of groundwater, or even surface storages of water are actually recharged, not over the ground, but through the ground.
Right.
And so when you start to see all of these things, then you come to understand, like, why do certain places have problems with drought? Why do certain places have problems with floods? And then this, extends to even problems with climate, because effectively what happens is you break the water cycle.
Right.
And, talk about, pressure effects and albedo and all of those things. You see just how much of what happens on land drives what happens in the atmosphere. Right. And then ultimately this is going to have some kind of impact. It's going to have consequences for the ability of people to live lives that are, that have some semblance of stability.
Yeah.
Right. So if none of these things are available to you any longer in terms of the proper ecological functioning of a place, you got to go somewhere else, right? If it can't support you. And so the only difference now is that, based on the types of, population densities that you had in the past,
right.
What used to be a more localized phenomenon is now basically happening everywhere at the same time at a more accelerated rate.
Right.
Right. So, but the dynamic is the same that it's always been.
Right. And so we know that civilizations collapse when they're out of right relationship with the land. And we know we're doing all this destruction. And yet, like, we don't seem to be acting with that knowledge on a collective basis.
There's a bit of cognitive dissonance.
What do you think is going on here? Like, why are we missing the mark so badly?
I think we're doing exactly what it is we've been trained to do, what it is that we've been conditioned to do and sort of acculturated to do. I think at this point, people have been shaped by, I guess what could be called a sort of an industrial or consumerist epistemology or cosmology, where you exist in the world as a consumer. You exist in the world to consume. And so everything that is like the crucible that you've been shaped within is that, right? It is human being as consumer. And so the only thing that you are really seen as being able to offer that is considered useful or of benefit is to exist in the world as a consumer. I remember when it occurred to me one day that, if you look at the measure of what, how countries assess their sort of national health. Like you're looking at GDP, like gross domestic product, gross national product, which is mostly driven by consumer activity. The odd thing, the odd thing to, you arrive at, this very strange conclusion you arrive at is like, well, what if you lived in a society or a community where you produce the things you consume? Technically, you don't contribute anything to the economy because you're not operating in the midst of the economy as a consumer.
Right.
That's a very strange thing to think about.
Right. If I grow my own food, but that's anti-progress.
Right. You're telling me that, say, if I become responsible for my life,
right,
or the community that I live within becomes responsible, like for our lives, because we're seeing to our needs and we're not relying on somebody else to do it. Like I'm not contributing anything to the society. It's really strange. So, you have to ask yourself, well, what is the usefulness of that metric?
Yeah.
If somehow my being responsible, my being able to produce the things that I need in order to live my life, or again, the lives of those who are around me. I'm able to contribute to their being able to live their lives without having to rely on some distant actor that's producing the stuff for me, and I have no idea what the impacts are of how those things are actually provided to me. Like, that doesn't have any beneficial impact on the society within which I live.
But the economic system, I mean, how much do you think it's like innate in humans, given that we do have that historical context to draw from, that our economic system is reflecting some sort of biases about how much do we value convenience, or how much do we, activate greed and consumption, versus how much do you think that the culture is a function of the economy and the rules and the capitalist logic?
Well, I mean, this is a assiduously designed outcome. I mean, so if you think about all of the things that shape the society, to what degree advertising and marketing, and then how advertising and marketing is actually, heavily shaped and informed by, like, psychoanalysis. Like, you're really trying to understand the human being. How do they function at a base level psychologically?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the I remember one of the great revelations for me was seeing, I don't know if you're an Adam Curtis fan.
Love Adam Curtis.
Love
Curtis.
Like, I knew,
you nailed it.
Probably,
yeah.
So, like, Adam Curtis is like one of my, I think he's one
Century
of my
of the
greatest
Self
teachers.
changed my
No,
life.
it's exactly Century. I remember when that came out.
Yeah.
I was in England. I was we were at a friend's house in Cambridge. And I was supposed to be flying back to California, and the friend whose house we were at said, "Have you seen this? Like, have you seen this film, Century of the Self?" Adam Curtis. Like, no. He's like, "You have to watch this." It was like 2 a.m, and there are 4 episodes.
And then it was
like
5 in the morning. Yeah, like still going.
4 or 5 hours. Like, literally, I stayed up. I stayed up all night watching these films. And I was just like, I can't believe they're actually showing stuff on television.
Yeah.
They kind of give it up the whole secret.
Yeah.
But the whole Edward Bernays thing.
Yeah.
And the fact that Bernays,
Freud's nephew.
Yes, Freud's nephew.
Kind of burst a lot of modern advertising kind of tactics.
Totally. I mean, Freud's American nephew who makes the first English translations of psychoanalysis available. And this is the guy who's basically hired. I mean, the whole story about how he was brought in by R.J. Reynolds or Philip Morris to get women to smoke.
Right. Because at that time,
women didn't smoke.
Yeah. And it worked. Yeah.
And he would talk about how stupid people are all the time. And then he moves into politics, and then you come to understand, like, oh, this is how
it's designed.
This is how people are. He talked about the shaping of the mass mind, like the public mind, and how malleable people are,
right,
and how easy they are to influence. And he was constantly, I remember in that film, his daughter, Bernays' daughter, kept on talking about how he would always say how stupid people were. And so here you have a man who's like, he knows that he's manipulating people. And it's like a game.
Right.
And, and this is the basis upon which products, not only products, but also, many aspects of politics, it's all based on this technique used to manipulate the public mind.
Can we use the wisdom of right relationship with land and the fundamental psychological tools of education and reaching people to shape public consciousness back into more of an ecological lens of living in right relationship on this planet? I mean, do you have a hopeful view of that, or is it always just going to be, this kind of cynical, manipulated, consumerist?
I mean, I think, it's the world is whatever people imagine it to be. I mean, it's funny because, we were talking earlier about, how faith kind of figures into, a lot of the work that I do. And, so there's certain aspects of what one believes in terms of like as we were saying earlier, so the cosmology.
You referred to it as the big questions.
Like the big questions, yeah. So that there are these larger questions that, I think when you come at you arrive at a certain point in your life, or you have certain things that happen. Like, I was talking earlier about, losing my father at 19, like where you want to know.
Yeah.
And I can remember one of the thoughts that had occurred to me at that time was, I don't want to be lied to anymore about what all this is and what I'm supposed to be doing, where I'm supposed to be at. And, I want to, like, what am I supposed to be doing? My mother used to tell me that all the time. She'd say, my mom God rest her dead. She used to always say, I remember you would always say to me, I just want to find out what I'm supposed to do. And I think, when you're faced with your mortality, like through watching other people pass on, and you arrive at this realization, like, oh, that's gonna be me one day. That becomes a serious. It's not an interesting intellectual musing anymore. Like, you really want to know, because you know that that has bearing on your life. So, these big questions that you want to have answered. I mean, we were just talking about them earlier. There's like the cosmological question, like, what is all this? The cosmogonical question, like, where did it come from? The ontological question, like, what am I? The epistemological question, like, what do I know? Or what do I think I know? Or how do I know that I know what I think I know? Like, how do I know I'm not deluded? Then there's the what are called the soteriological question, like, what do I need to do in order to meet, like, what am I supposed to be doing while I'm here? Like, in order to meet like a favorable end. The teleological question, like, what is my purpose? And then like the eschatological question, like, where am I going? Like, what is the end? And you want to be able to answer those, like, definitively. Like, you want like, you don't want to guess at those things, and you don't want to rely on somebody else's guessing or theorizing. Like, I want an answer that is like authoritative and I can trust. And then I think ultimately this is when you arrive at looking at or investigating spirituality or faith traditions, these things. But to kind of get back to what you were asking, I mean, the world does not need to be in the state that it is, right? And it is in the state that it is because of certain assumptions that people make about how it works or how it doesn't work. So I'll give you like a simple example. Some people believe that the default condition of the world is scarcity. Some people believe that the default condition of the world is abundance. Well, if you believe that the world is by default scarce, then the way that you operate in it is going to be entirely different than the person who believes that the default condition of the world is abundance. Right? If you believe that it's scarce, you're less likely to be generous. Right. You're going to hoard things. You're going to keep stuff for yourself, even to the extent that, like, you can't possibly use all the stuff that you're hoarding, but just in case, you're going to hang on to it.
Right.
Even at the expense of, like, knowing that there are people out there that don't have enough. As opposed to, if you believe that, the default condition of the world is abundance, like, you're not worried about not having enough, right? Because you believe that there's enough for everybody, right? There's more than enough for everybody. So I don't have to hoard. Right? I don't have to prevent someone else from getting the things that they need in order to live, a dignified life. But it depends on what are your starting assumptions. And I think there's there are a couple of very interesting references that actually come out of the Islamic tradition, if I could bring that up.
Please.
So there's something called the Hadith Qudsi, right, which is a report that comes from it's from the Prophet Muhammad, right? It's from him, but it's a quote that is it's a quote that's attributed to God. but it's not revelation. Something different, like what's in the Quran, that's revelation. But a hadith Qudsi is something that is said to have been a statement from God, but it's not wahi. So one of the things that God said, apparently, is he says that I am in the opinion of my slave. I'm in the opinion of that which I have created. If he thinks of me much, that's what he finds. And if he thinks that I'm nothing, then that's what he finds. So you could have two people looking at the same thing, and based on what they assume about what is they're looking at, they can come to wildly different conclusions. Sure. And then that opinion that they have about this thing that they're looking at is sort of affirmed, right? Because everything that they see, because they have this idea fixed in their mind, is going to sort of reify this idea. Oh, the world's scarce. Everything that they look at is going to kind of like tip them more in that direction, right? But there's also this understanding that actions are judged according to their intentions, right? So if the world, right, how one understands the world is based on one's opinion, right, of God, right, of the entity that brought it into being. And if our actions are judged by their intentions, then what are the opinions that inform your intentions, right? Because if your opinion is that the world is, again, it's just scarcity, and it's brutality, and it's like
zero sum.
I got to get mine first before somebody else does. Then the intentions that inform your actions are going to be categorically different than someone who has the opinion that they live in a world that is abundant and there's more than enough for everyone, and the intentions that are formed on the basis of that opinion is going to lead you to an entirely different set of actions and outcomes. So depending on where people are oriented in that regard, then that will determine what kind of outcome you're going to get, right? So in that sense, there's this sort of like, I don't know if you remember as a kid, you had these these books, these choose your own ending books. I used to love those books. I used to love those books as a kid. Yeah, it's like choose your own ending. Like you get to pick what door you want to go through, right? So the world is whatever it is, whatever you choose it to be. So yeah, it's up to you. If we can kind of get more people, out of the the scarcity bag. I mean, look, they're like what, 5 people on this planet that have more wealth than half of than the combined wealth of half of the population of the planet, something like that. There's your proof right there. How do you have 5 or 8 individuals, whatever it is? How do you have single-digit individuals that hold more wealth than half of humanity? There's your proof. There's more than enough for everybody. These guys can't, even if you were the most hardcore hedonist, like the most just fundamentalist, party animal. There's only much dope you can do before you die. There's only much sex you can have. There's only but so much party you can do before you just pass out. You just clip out. I mean, what can you do? At some point, it gets boring.
Right.
Like you don't kill yourself. So it's just like at some point you realize, I would actually be a lot better off in making sure that other people besides myself, are taken care of. And I'm still living high off the hog. But I know that other people can make use of what it is that I have in making having a better life and having a dignified life that isn't, misery and drudgery.
And I think a lot of what I hear people in kind of more the technocratic circles examining in that just insanity that we have such an uneven distribution of wealth and resources on this planet, at least in financial terms, is that like we've constructed this game and these are points on the game and people just get addicted to scoring a high score, and that's how they're deriving self-worth and esteem. And it's kind of the only thing that they know to do at some point, and then they just keep doing it and just keep doing it and just keep doing it. How do you live your life in right relationship and in a way where you're not focused on a bank account balance or just some one narrow GDP measure of worth, and to really follow those signals of like, yeah, this person needs something and I can help?
The ultimate reality check is death. That's the ultimate reality check. Probably is interesting. There's another quote from the Prophet Muhammad. He said, actually, it's funny that this quote comes to mind. He said, do much remembrance of the destroyer of pleasures.
Do much. Explain to me that.
Do much remembrance of the destroyer of pleasures. Because by and large, the reason why, we're into acquiring things is because it provides us the ability to do the things that we like. Like whether it's, you like going on vacation, or you like driving nice cars, you like buying nice clothes, you like, the companionship of whoever it is you like the companionship of, you like getting high, you like getting drunk. But what's crazy about all of those things is they're all escapes. It's all a means of escaping or distracting you from life. Like from the reality of life. So the question I would have is what is so awful about your life that you're constantly trying to escape from it? That's the problem. And money doesn't cure that. At some point, there's this more, I think, critically important, profound problem of trying to understand what it is that people are constantly trying to run away from or distract themselves from having to face. Such that they live in such excess that it also ends up resulting in other people not being able to get access to the things that they need to just live a basic, dignified existence. And so the relationship is, the relationship is you're talking about, like, again, living, trying to live in some kind of harmony with the land, with the planet. I think one of the things that I've come to learn, and it's interesting because this is also kind of communicated in the writings of some of the books that I had talked about, was that there's this idea, this understanding that land sort of translates or reflects the state of the people that live in that place.
I've heard you say you had a beautiful series of meditations. We'll link to it on YouTube. And you said something that really stuck with me, which is the land does not lie.
Oh, land does not lie. Yeah. Which actually that comes from Loudermilk's book, where, he said that land does not lie, that it tells the truth of who a people are, because they write their record on the land. And all the world does is it just simply reflects us. It either reflects our dysfunction and our disquietude, our turbulence, our dissonance, or it reflects our our tranquility or our peace, or any of the terms that would kind of be in line with any of those other descriptions.
I live out in the country, and we have space out in rural New Zealand, and it's so fascinating how different people in these different kind of lifestyle blocks, the gardens and the landscapes that surround them are such this funny mirror and reflection of the personalities and the people and the contexts. And like, if you look at my garden year by year, it's like, it's such a mirror of what's happening in my life, And sometimes, at first it was very methodical in terms of like, here's the fence is here and it's going to be in the rows like this and da-da-da-da. And then you go through the phase of like, it's just a weedy mess, and like there's just no, it's all chaos, and then and then like it just the progression of, and then you wake up in the morning and it re-anchors you back into your context of your life.
Sure.
Right? It's like no matter how lost up here I get, then I look back and it's like the human body. It's just a constant reflection of the decisions I'm making.
That's it. I mean, and what's funny is that, I mean, this idea that there's an understanding in our tradition that the world is like a theophany, right? There's that. Remember, I was mentioning to you
what's a theophany?
Yeah, it's like it's almost like a it's an expression of the divine, right? And specifically of what we would call divine attributes. So in the Islamic tradition, it said that God has 99 names, but the names are all attributes, right? He's Ar-Rahman, he's like he's the compassionate, he's Ar-Rahim, he's the merciful, he's Al-Malik, he's the king, like he's Qudus, he's the holy, he's he said that God has Jalali and Jamali attributes. He has majestic and beautiful attributes. And so all you see in the world is some expression of majesty or some expression of beauty. Right. And so the reason why it's so important to have nature as a reference is because that's how you reference the attributes. Even in yourself, it's the attributes are even in you, right? It's that these are all
nature,
right? These are all signs. In Arabic, they're called ayats. Like, so in the Quran, like when you read verses, those are called ayats. But everything out there is called an ayat as well. Even you are an ayat. You're a sign. And so the reason why it's so important to have that as a reference is because, as you just said, it sort of grounds you. You have a reference now. You know where you are in relation to, this grand scheme that points toward the one that brought it into being, right? And so, I mean, this is kind of one of the problems in living in a city, is that the city in many ways is kind of like this infrastructural transplant, where you've removed one set of infrastructure and you replaced it with something else. And the infrastructure that you've replaced it with is a reflection of the people who designed it and whatever's going on with them. Even to the extent that, you don't have the same access to those references. You can't even see the stars, right? Because of the artificial light. Right. And so in many ways, if you kind of stay in this place long enough, you kind of become a planet out of orbit, because you don't have the reference anymore that's providing the gravity that keeps you where you're supposed to be, where you need to be. Right. And again, if you're in the midst of that kind of disorder or dysfunction long enough, like you don't, like all those 5 questions that the 5+ questions that I had talked about wanting or needing to answer previously, like you don't have any reference for being able to, again, definitively answer those questions in the ways that you need to be able to answer them for you to have a sure understanding that you are actually in the world in a manner that you are supposed to be in the world. And then again, the world ends up just reflecting the disorder and the dysfunction and the dissonance that is you, right? Or is a group of other, people who are just like you, if not worse. Right. Right. So you have this this compound dissonance, right? This compounded, turbulence, and then the world's going to end up kind of entraining to that, or just simply reflecting that.
And we're not even always aware of the wrongness that we feel, and what that, you said, what we're running away from, what we're trying to escape from, because we've inherited the designs of a flawed set of thinking, or the errors in our ways of the past.
I mean, look, why is it all I mean, why do you think people drink and take dope? And why do people do that? Because people are hurt.
Totally.
Right? Because, disorder, dissonance, like that's all that. It's just masking.
Totally.
It's just a distraction. It's to take their minds off the fact that they're hurt.
Yeah.
So again, the signs are all around. The indications are all around you.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you are constantly having to do things to distance yourself from yourself, that's a problem. Mm-hmm. And if you are no longer able to actually be in yourself and have your wits about you and be fully aware of what's going on, so that you can actually do the things that need doing, you're going to live in a place that's pretty disorderly. Because people are just simply trying to cope with their pain. And so, I'm many, and lots. I spend a lot of time just kind of observing things, just trying to figure out like what's going on. Because you really can't hope to solve a problem that you have misdiagnosed. And I think we do a lot of misdiagnosing of problems, which is why we aren't really able to solve them, right, again, definitively.
Right. And when you teach permaculture, I mean, my impression is you're not trying to just take this mechanized view of like, okay, these are the biological systems, we put them together in these new forms and shapes, and boom, we get out of this ecological crisis. Like you're talking about ethics, you're talking about right relationship, you're talking about right and wrong, and like, it's how does that lens intersect with kind of regenerative design?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about earlier how I think a lot of I think as an engineer, I mean, you worked in Silicon Valley. That's how I got to California, where you operate in a world where technique is what everybody is fascinated by. Technique/technology, like how you do things, and you're constantly trying to figure out how to get past some technical hurdle. And I think what ends up happening is you develop this capacity to do all kinds of things without necessarily stopping to ask the question whether or not these things that you are actually capable of doing, should I be doing them even if I can?
Yeah.
But that's another faculty that you have to that has to be developed, right? And so we're supposedly like our species is called like Homo sapien, right? We're the wise being, right? We're not Homo faber, right? The clever being. But I think most of us kind of operate like under that ethos, like it's that really your value is derived from being able to put on display how clever you are, and then being able to monetize it by like, you develop some super trick proprietary technology or intellectual property, and you figure out some great, marketing campaign to push it on everybody, and then you try to shoehorn your product into, everybody's lives.
That's how I got my start.
It's like, that is the game, isn't it? That's the game.
That's the game.
But but again, I think at some point, you kind of like, I think if you have your wits about you, you're like, yeah, there's something deeply wrong with that. And it doesn't really get at, I think, again, if you're thinking seriously about your life, it does not actually move you any closer to being able to answer again these big questions, so that you're actually able to satisfy this something that's kind of deep at your core, that allows for you to approximate, again, figuring out why it is that you're here, and then being able to serve that function. So I think that the great thing about permaculture is, I think it's a really, or again, I think just generally regenerative design, ecological design, is that it's kind of this alloying the technical and the ethical. where, for that part of your brain that's really into, again, how things work and how things go together, and trying to figure all that stuff out. It's great. It's really fascinating. And I think the other thing that's fascinating about it is you're not dealing with um, you're not dealing with things that are dead or inert.
Right.
Right. It's like they everything that you are are working with has it has a nature.
Mm.
Right. It has some kind of operational directive that it's following, and you're just trying to position all of these things in the best way possible so that everyone not only gets what they need, but they're able to sort of express themselves, and kind of express their essence, in the best way possible. I mean, like Joel Salatin, the talks about, the chickenness of the chicken, like wanting to put the chicken in a place where they could fully express their chickenhood. Well, I mean, that's like you're trying to do that with everything that like you're assembling in the confines of design. You want to position everything so that they can be the fullest, best version of themselves.
Right.
But then that only talking about things in terms of the technical, it doesn't suffice. Like there's this other set of information that you have to access that informs the process. So that, so in permaculture, it's earth care, people care, fair share, reinvestment of the surplus. And then you have all of these principles that are, derived from, observations of how natural systems work. And then you're just trying to figure out, okay, well, how do I fit what it is that I'm trying to do into, this set of operational principles so that I'm not stepping on anybody's toes. And that's really where things get interesting, because you do recognize that there are these limits that you have to operate within, and that it's not a free for all. Like you're not forcing things that shouldn't be there. And so there's a recognition that you have a place, right? You have a position that you're supposed to play. And if you play your position, then the game's great, right? Everything, runs as it should. But if you don't play your position, and again, you're trying to put yourself in places that you don't belong, that's when things begin to go awry.
I'm really curious what else you've learned about what the Islamic faith and tradition says about land and our relationship with Earth.
Well, actually, there's an understanding that the earth is your mother. Right? That is actually a quote that's attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. Right? The earth is your mother. And there's also another understanding that, paradise lies at the foot of your mother. Right? So that's another. So it's a Beautiful. Very interesting idea. There's also specific references to the value of reviving dead land. Right? If it says that the person who plants a tree or sows a field, right? If a person, actually specifically says, if a Muslim plants a tree or sows a field, and whatever of a bird or an animal or a person like eats from it, that whatever was consumed from it counts as charity for the person that planted the seed. I mean, he even juxtaposes something as serious as the end of time with the planting of a seedling or a sapling. Right? So the prophet said, if the end of time comes and you are planting a seedling or a sapling, he said, finish planting it. I didn't say freak out. He didn't say run for the hills. He said, no, finish what you're doing. And he could have juxtaposed the end of time with something else. Why did he juxtapose it with the planting of a seedling or a sapling?
Wow.
Right. There's also it's another great hadith where he said that he talks about, there's this sort of trading, commerce is a very big part of the tradition. And but one of the things that he was said to have intimated was, he said that the farmer is trading with his Lord. That the farmer is transacting with God when he's tending to land, because of what I mentioned earlier, that kind of all of this that we're in the midst of, again, even ourselves, is the scholar Ibn al-Arabi, he said that the world is nothing more, this universe is nothing more than the translation of divine speech. Right. So there's a verse in a surah, in a chapter called Yasin, where there's a famous portion of a verse where it says that God just says, be, and it is. Kun fayakun. Right. And it's all, so the world is that phrase translated into matter. Right. So we are manifestations of this speech. So the understanding is that if you have someone who makes a claim to having a belief and a love and a regard for God, right, for the divine, then you would have to have a love and a regard for what it was that God had made, right? Because that is the means by which you come to know what the divine is, because it actually is an expression of divine attributes. And so there's your reference. And that is how you stay grounded. It's how you stay connected. That's where you learn the lesson, is actually by looking at what the divine has created, right? Which is just a reflection of, again, these attributes of the divine. So there's actually an understanding that you have these two books that you can read, right? There's the written book, which is, again, the sort of the revelation of the Quran. And then you have the visual book. And the visual book is the creation. So you have the two books that serve as your reference. So, but in order for you to have it as a reference, it's got to be there.
Yeah. Right. And you have to observe it.
And it has to be there in order for you to be able to observe it. Well, if it's not there anymore, there's nothing to observe. Right. So your reference is gone. And so now, like, where do you actually go to learn the lesson? Where do you go to, again, properly be able to orient yourself or recalibrate yourself? And I don't know how many people I've talked to who, whenever they've like found themselves at a very difficult point in their lives, like just really like seriously like trying times, where do they retreat to? They always end up retreating into, nature. Like I work with a guy, it's an amazing story. I work with this guy in this project in Afghanistan for like the past 11 to 12 years. And this guy's had the most incredible trial, like these things that have happened to him, this trauma in his life. He had been experienced chronic serial sexual molestation by his grandfather, who was a priest, was like a reverend for years, and he didn't tell his parents. He tried to tell them, and they didn't. They were like, "What are you talking about? This can't be true." And then eventually he admitted to it. And then his mother was so distraught that, she wasn't able to protect him from it. She kills herself. Right. And so this guy is now walking around with these two people that really kind of at the core of forming the basis of his life, that have either violated him or that have, that he no longer has, like your mother. And so now he's just spun out. He's just trying to figure out, like, how do I cope with this? And so as I was saying earlier, for years, he'd engaged in all kinds of excesses with substances and things just to deal with the pain. But then eventually he starts to put himself back together by actually retreating into nature, into the forest,
Right.
and just kind of living rough in, in and among nature. And then that's how he's able to begin to get some semblance of his sanity back, because he has the reference, whether or not he realized that. But that's what was happening. And then that was where he begins to, travel the road of kind of getting his kind of mental and emotional health back. And then he I mean, his story is amazing. I mean, that's a whole nother that's a whole nother discussion. But I think it's an illustration of the power of being able to have access again to some, or be connected to something that again embodies those attributes again, which is it's the natural world.
Loving this conversation, and I know we're running up on time. I really appreciate you on a whim sitting down with me and sharing.
Yeah, this was not what I was expecting to do today. But
I love it.
I love it.
I appreciate the faith and the trust, and I'm curious if there's any ways that people can follow you and your work, and also any last messages that you'd like to share.
Yeah, so I recently moved back to the Bay Area to work with Zaytuna College and their Center for Ethical Living and Learning, which was actually a program that started back in 2018. I was able to teach some permaculture design courses, regenerative design courses. And also we did an installation. We did a design that actually is sort of an example of the kinds of things that we're learning in the classroom. So that's all located at the upper campus at Zaytuna College, which is at Grizzly Peak, Berkeley. It's the old, I think it's the old Lutheran Seminary of the Pacific. And so what we're now planning on doing is developing what I like to call a program of applied ethics, to where we're going to expand this design to where the students and staff and community members are going to produce food, and also kind of flesh out this kind of ecological kind of palette that the campus will embody. And there'll be a series of classes and courses and activities that are going to be based around the maintenance of the campus and the things that can be produced from it that will benefit not only the Zaytuna College community, but also the surrounding community. So there's a series of programming that we're beginning to put together for that. I'm hoping we can have local folks come through, or if they're not local, if you want to come and visit, you're more than welcome.
Cool.
So if you do a search for Zaytuna College or the Zaytuna College Center for Ethical Living and Learning, you can find some information about the program, and we'll be adding to that again soon enough.
Amazing, love it. Any final words or reflections? Wisdom with Rhamis.
Oh God, wisdom with Rhamis. Well, I mean, it's like what I had said at the end of the reflection film. As long as we're waking up in the morning, it's we got another day to get it right. We got another day to get it right, another opportunity, and even if everything isn't figured out in your time here. I mean, as I was just quoting, that quote about if the end of time comes and you're planting a seedling or a sapling, finish planting it. Well, I mean, that's not necessarily only a reference to like the end of time and the time. It's to our own individual, end of time. But, the most important thing is there's a job to do. And as long as I think we're clear of the importance and the imperative and the urgency of doing that job, then the mission's clear. And you just keep going till the wheels fall off. That's it. Just finish planting it.
Thank you, Rhamis.
Thank you, man.
That was fun.
It was fun.
Well, I hope you had a good time with that one. I appreciate how Rhamis was able to just pick up the conversation, even though we had just met. There's links in the show notes. Find more conversations at maearth.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.